Johnny Carson severely reprimanded 8 guests, banning them from his show permanently. The merciless ruler of the wee hours. With his iconic grin and boundless charisma, Johnny Carson dominated late-night television for 3 decades. Americans thought they knew the man behind the desk, the friendly Midwesterner who could put anyone at ease, and invited him into their living rooms. However, there was a totally different Johnny Carson hiding beneath that amiable veneer, a guy whose power to destroy careers rests on his inability to forgive, his deep-seated fears, and his recollection. A producer who worked with Johnny for more than 15 years on The Tonight Show disclosed that Johnny never forgot or forgiven. Once you crossed him, it wasn't only that night's program that you were booted. You were totally removed from the kingdom. According to a close acquaintance of Johnny's, he was born in Nebraska, but had the behavior of a Sicilian. Never once did he yell out. He was never one to cause a public uproar. He just stopped interacting with people altogether. The withdrawal had far-reaching ramifications, considering his prominence in the industry, going beyond the mere loss of a booking. Even apparently little infractions might put someone on Carson's permanent blacklist, which was the most alarming part. Although some visitors were banished for truly terrible actions, others were exiled for transgressions so minor that they failed to perceive their error until it was too late. The 8 visitors who did Carson's worst transgressions will be revealed tonight. The famous people whose careers and lives were irreparably damaged when they were booted off television's most influential platform. Among these crimes that ended Carson's career, Joan Rivers' treachery received the greatest attention, but it was only the beginning of his vicious treatment of anybody who dared to challenge him. After Carson's death, other hosts unaffiliated with the King's resentments took over, and some of the bans were eventually overturned, while some stayed in place for almost 20 years. First, though, let's take a look at the treachery that devastated Carson and sparked the most famous feud in television history. The pain was so great that not even death could alleviate it entirely. The treacheries. Everybody knows Joan Rivers, who will be my next guest. Century City's Plaza 4 is hosting her performance. She'll be available throughout the remainder of the week. The betrayal of Carson's protege, Joan Rivers, was one of them. When Joan Rivers came on The Tonight Show, she was more than just a comedian. She became one of the most influential women in comedy, immediately after being Johnny Carson's chosen protege and the first permanent guest presenter of the show. Carson had a hand in grooming her for the role. A writer who collaborated with both comics noted that Johnny did more than simply provide Joan with a platform. He also offered her his tacit backing. Getting Carson's stamp of approval was like getting needed in an industry when female comedians were still battling for fundamental respect. The man was essential in her professional success. After years of working together, their professional relationship had blossomed into a true friendship. During a time when female comedians were often disregarded, Carson offered Rivers advice on her material, brought her to private meals, and publicly lauded her ability. Carson took up the role of a father figure for Rivers, who needed an ally in her field. Joan once claimed that Johnny was the first influential TV personality who never demanded payment for his endorsement. According to a close Rivers friend, Carson was greatly shocked by what transpired in 1986, since he supported her only because of her talent, and she was extremely appreciative. Subtly, the treachery started. Fox, a new network that was trying to compete with the Big Three, made an incredible offer to Rivers, her very own late-night talk program that airs across from Carson. If the rumor is true, Rivers would be the highest-paid host on late night, with a yearly compensation of $10 million. The offer was very enticing because Rivers was becoming increasingly worried about her future with NBC network. Management had made it plain that Rivers would not be considered as Carson's replacement upon his retirement, despite her popularity as a guest presenter. According to a television historian, Joan was about to hit her 50s while working in a profession that is known to be cruel to women as they age. Money was only one aspect of the Fox offer. Regarding her career, it was all about ownership and security. In spite of the agonizing choice, Rivers took Fox up on his offer, ways to break the news to Carson, the guy responsible for her professional success and a friend and mentor she truly loved. An insider who worked with Rivers at the time stated that she was petrified by the prospect of having such discussion. In her pursuit of the ideal time and words, she repeatedly put it off. That time never arrived. Fox, on the other hand, informed the media before Rivers could inform Carson in person. Rather than hearing it from her, he read about her betrayal in a Variety magazine headline. This assumed betrayal sliced at Carson's deepest vulnerabilities, as a guy whose formative years were defined by emotional desertion, an emotionally aloof father, and a mother who withheld her approval. One of the employees there that day described how Johnny turned completely white upon seeing the headline. His tone was calm. Things weren't thrown by him. With a casual, "She didn't even call me," he strided over to his office. More unsettling than any explosion would have been that subtle pain. Quick and decisive was Carson's reply. Upon hearing Rivers' name, he promptly issued an order to remove it from future Tonight Show appearances. Compilation programs were stripped of all footage showcasing her. It was very forbidden for guest hosts to make any mention of her. She seemed to have vanished from the annals of the program altogether. "He told me she's dead to me," revealed Carson's longtime producer Fred Dordova. And when Johnny said someone was dead to him, he meant it literally. They ceased to exist in his world. Rivers attempted repeatedly to apologize. She sent letters, called Carson's private number, even sent elaborate gifts to his home. Each attempt was met with the same response: silence. The packages came back marked, "Return to sender," remembered Rivers' assistant. The calls were never returned. It was as if she was screaming into a void. The ban extended far beyond The Tonight Show. Carson's influence meant that Rivers became persona non grata throughout NBC and much of the television industry. Former friends suddenly became unavailable. Invitations dried up. Her career entered a devastating tailspin. Joan always said that losing Johnny's friendship was worse than losing the Tonight Show platform, noted a close friend. She could survive professionally, but the personal loss haunted her for the rest of her life. The ban remained in effect for the remainder of Carson's tenure and beyond. Rivers did not appear on The Tonight Show again until 2014, 22 years after Carson's retirement, and 9 years after his death when Jimmy Fallon finally invited her back. By then, Rivers had rebuilt her career through sheer determination, but the wound never fully healed. In her final years, she still became emotional when discussing Carson, telling interviewers, "He gave me my career and I hurt him." That pain never goes away. T-Mobile Arena, which had just been built. And, so they asked two. Wayne Newton, the backstage threat that crossed the line. Wayne Newton had been a frequent target of Carson's monologue jokes throughout the 1970s, particularly regarding his Las Vegas image and what Carson called his suspiciously youthful appearance. The jokes were relatively mild by Tonight Show standards, but they hit a nerve with Newton, who had spent years carefully crafting his public persona. The breaking point came in 1980, when Carson incorporated suggestive jokes about Newton's sexuality into his monologue, implications that were particularly damaging in an era when such insinuations could destroy an entertainer's career, especially one who performed in conservative markets. What happened next became one of the most notorious backstage confrontations in television history. Wayne didn't call. He didn't have his manager complain. He showed up in person, recalled a security guard who was working at NBC's Burbank studios that day, and he wasn't there for a friendly chat. Newton bypassed normal security protocols by using his celebrity status to gain entry to the building, then made his way directly to Carson's office. According to multiple witnesses, he entered without knocking and found Carson reviewing that night's monologue cards. Johnny looked up, surprised but not alarmed at first, remembered Carson's assistant, who was present for the beginning of the confrontation. His expression changed quickly when he realized this wasn't a social call. What exactly was said remains somewhat disputed, but Newton himself has confirmed the essence of the exchange in subsequent interviews. By his own admission, he told Carson, "You can make fun of my music, you can make fun of my hair, but if you ever make another joke about my sexuality, I'll kick your ass." For Carson, who had built his career on fearless comedy and never backing down from a joke, this direct physical threat represented an unforgivable line crossed. Johnny stood up very slowly, recalled his assistant. He was significantly taller than Newton, and he used that height advantage. Without raising his voice, he simply said, "Get out of my office before I have you thrown out." The confrontation ended without physical violence, but its repercussions were immediate and permanent. Carson personally instructed his booking team that Newton was never to be invited on The Tonight Show again, a ban that remained in effect for the remainder of Carson's 30-year tenure. Johnny could handle criticism. A furious caller wouldn't be a problem for him. What he couldn't and wouldn't tolerate was physical intimidation, explained a producer who worked closely with Carson. In his mind, Newton had transformed from a joke target to a genuine threat. There was no coming back from that. The ban had real consequences for Newton's career trajectory. While he remained popular in Las Vegas, his national television exposure diminished significantly in the years that followed. Without access to The Tonight Show, then the essential platform for mainstream exposure, Newton's ability to promote new projects to a nationwide audience was severely limited. Being banned by Johnny didn't just mean losing one show, noted a former NBC executive. It meant losing the most important publicity vehicle in American entertainment. For someone like Newton, who was trying to expand beyond his Vegas base, it was devastating. Newton has discussed the ban in subsequent years, expressing no regrets about confronting Carson. In a 2007 interview, he stated, "I would do exactly the same thing today. Some things are worth standing up for, even if there's a price to pay professionally." What makes this ban particularly significant is how it revealed Carson's zero-tolerance policy for anything he perceived as a threat to his physical safety or the controlled environment he created. At The Tonight Show, while he might forgive professional missteps or even personal slights, threatening the man himself was an offense from which there was no recovery. That was the most humble, just kind of self-acing entrance I see. 3 Charles Grodin. When confrontational comedy crossed the line. On paper, Charles Grodin should have been a perfect Tonight Show guest. Intelligent, quick-witted, and capable of the dry, slightly sardonic humor that Carson himself favored. But what began as an entertaining deviation from the standard celebrity interview format gradually evolved into something that deeply unsettled Carson, eventually resulting in one of his most puzzling but definitive bans. Grodin first appeared on The Tonight Show in the mid-1970s, promoting his breakout role in the film The Heartbreak Kid. Unlike most guests who arrived prepared to tell prearranged amusing anecdotes, Grodin took a different approach. He played an aggressively difficult version of himself, challenging Carson's questions and acting vaguely hostile toward the host. The first time he did it, Johnny was caught off guard, but played along brilliantly. Remembered a writer who worked on the show. Carson was a master of improvisation, and he recognized what Grodin was doing, creating uncomfortable comedy through tension. The audience ate it up. The success of that initial appearance led to Grodin being invited back repeatedly, with each visit pushing the confrontational persona further. What had begun as light sparring evolved into increasingly hostile exchanges with Grodin, questioning Carson's interviewing skills, suggesting he hadn't read Grodin's book, and accusing him of not caring about his guests. The problem was only Johnny and the producers knew for certain it was an act, explained a director who worked on several of Grodin's appearances. To the audience at home, it often looked like a genuinely uncomfortable interview with a difficult guest. The line between performance and reality became dangerously blurred. The breaking point came during a 1990 appearance, when Grodin's act veered into territory that struck too close to Carson's personal insecurities. According to those present, Grodin began mocking Carson's delivery and questioning whether he actually cared about any of his guests or just went through the motions for a paycheck. Johnny's smile got very tight, recalled a camera operator who was working that night. There's a difference between his performance smile and his genuine smile, and anyone who worked with him knew the difference immediately. This was the forced smile that meant he was not amused anymore. What made Grodin's comments particularly cutting was that they touched on Carson's greatest personal vulnerability, his difficulty with emotional intimacy. A man who had been married 4 times and was notoriously distant, even with close friends. Carson was sensitive to any suggestion that his on-air warmth was entirely performative. Johnny played along until the segment ended, but the minute they went to commercial, he turned to his producer and said, "We're done with that," revealed a staff member who overheard the exchange. Just those 4 words. Everyone knew exactly what he meant. Grodin was never explicitly told he was banned. He was simply never booked again during Carson's remaining years on the show. When Grodin's publicists would call to suggest him as a guest, they were told politely but firmly that the show was going in a different direction, or that the schedule was full. It wasn't an angry ban like with some other guests, noted a booking coordinator who worked on the show. It was more that Johnny had simply decided that particular comedic dynamic wasn't worth the discomfort it caused him. He had hundreds of potential guests to choose from. Why keep bringing back someone who made him uncomfortable, even if it was just an act? Grodin himself has acknowledged the ban in subsequent interviews, admitting that his confrontational persona might have gone too far. "I thought I was doing Andy Kaufman," he told one interviewer, but Johnny didn't find it funny. The Grodin ban illustrated something important about Carson's boundaries. He could take lighthearted jabs and witty humor in stride, but anything that made him look foolish or cast doubt on the credibility of the reputation he had worked so hard to cultivate for decades was met with indignation. Shelley Winters is the 4th. That incident where someone threw a drink which destroyed a career. Famous for her decades-long career that included timeless films like A Place in the Sun, The Poseidon Adventure, and The Diary of Anne Frank, Shelley Winters was a member of Hollywood aristocracy and a 2-time Oscar winner. Even while her brilliance was obvious, by the 1970s, her wild antics had made her famous in the business. A filmmaker who collaborated with Shelley at the time described her as talented, yet unpredictable. By that time in her career, she was drinking more and more frequently, which made her wildly angry and charming all at once. Over the years, Carson had conducted several successful interviews with Winters. Her larger-than-life attitude and natural storytelling abilities, honed over decades in Hollywood, make for compelling television. Her increasingly irrational behavior, however, has started to scare the personnel of The Tonight Show behind the scenes. She would come to pre-in looking absolutely fine, then show up to the actual taping in a totally different state, recalled a talent coordinator who worked on the show. Became a gamble every time we booked her. Which Shelley would we get? Unfortunately, Winters' 1975 visit went horribly wrong, practically from the stage entrance. This episode earned her a lifetime ban. As Winters sank onto the guest chair, other witnesses saw that she slurred her speech and appeared bewildered. There was a camera operator there that night, and Shelley kept interrupting, changing topics mid-sentence, and making remarks that weren't exactly relevant to the questions, despite Johnny's best efforts to gently guide her through the interview. Carson was attempting to keep up the impression of a casual discussion while his tension levels rose. The last straw was Carson's seemingly harmless quip on Winters' weight, something she had mockingly brought up in earlier appearances. But this time her response was totally different. Based on what one stagehand saw, she just snapped, the tale goes. One second she was laughing, or at least appearing to laugh, and the next second she had thrown her entire drink right in Johnny's face. Not a splash or a sip, the entire glass of whiskey, ice cubes and all. The audience burst out laughing. Carson kept his cool under pressure and promptly requested a commercial break, despite being wet and visibly startled. His renowned restraint, however, apparently disappeared the second the cameras stopped rolling, according to those in attendance. A producer recalled that he got up, drenched in sweat, and silently left the set. The look on his face was utterly menacing. I had never seen him that enraged in all my time working with him. As evidence of his professionalism, Carson went to his dressing room, changed into a new suit and tie, and then came back out to complete the show. During the break, Winters was swiftly removed out of the building. The results were immediate and long-lasting. During his 30-year tenure, Carson made it clear to his booking staff that Winters would never be invited back on The Tonight Show. It wasn't just about the drink. One off-screen producer told Carson when they spoke about the episode afterwards. According to Johnny, hosts and guests have an unwritten agreement to treat each other with dignity and conduct themselves professionally at all times. It was the most egregious and public breach of contract that Shelley could have imagined. For Winters' subsequent work, the restriction was a major setback. If an actor couldn't use Carson's sofa to promote their project on The Tonight Show, they would be unable to reach millions of prospective viewers. According to a Hollywood representative who was aware with Winter's work, her age and reputation for difficulties were already causing her film jobs to become less common. After leaving The Tonight Show, she lost touch with a large portion of the public. Even while she could still work, her days of receiving significant media attention had come to an end. Afterwards, Winters confirmed the ban when she told a 1990s interviewer that, considering her actions that night, it was likely fair. There was a dark period for her, she confessed. I now understood why Johnny wanted nothing to do with me ever again. The winter prohibition was noteworthy because it demonstrated Carson's strict policy of not allowing anything that could derail the tightly orchestrated atmosphere he established on The Tonight Show. Aggression directed toward the host personally could not be excused, unlike clumsy responses or minor disputes. Tommy Newsome, and remark on how charming he was. Jesus Laughs 5. Little Rich Guy, the strange vanishing of Carson's regular visitor. Among Johnny Carson's most dependable and regular guests for over a decade, impressionist Rich Little made over 30 appearances on The Tonight Show between the 1960s and 1970s. He was one of Carson's favorite performers, and viewers loved him for his spot-on voice impersonations of famous people and politicians. In an inexplicable turn of events, Little then disappeared from The Tonight Show lineup. There was no on-air incident or public spat. One of the most bewildering ensembles in the history of the show was formed when he just ceased making appearances. An insider who worked as a talent booker for The Tonight Show at the time said that Rich's abrupt departure was different from the other explosive banishments. You couldn't find a single instance to cite. Over time, he became unpopular for reasons that were unclear to most of the employees. Little, in contrast to other band guests, saw sustained success on subsequent television shows and concert appearances. Even after leaving Carson's Tonight Show in the 1980s, he continued to be a TV mainstay. The issue was further complicated because Little was perplexed by the show's abrupt rejection of him after his numerous appearances. The call never came again, no matter how long I waited. Minimal information was divulged during an interview given in 2010. I did get the message in the end, but Johnny never told me straight out what had transpired. Relatives and friends of Carson claim that the band was born out of his increasing distaste for behind-the-scenes activities rather than any public event. A Carson-affiliated producer claimed that Johnny found him progressively obnoxious when they weren't filming. Even when the cameras weren't filming, Rich would remain in character and execute impressions continuously. Johnny had to go through hours of rehearsals and commercial breaks of what audiences thought interesting for just 10 minutes. Carson apparently took a dim view of Little's incessant need for praise and attention and became frustrated by her inclination to be on all the time. Carson valued genuine connections with others and found it exhausting. A writer who happened to overhear Johnny muttering, "Does he even have his own voice?" during a particularly draining pre-show meeting, remembers the comment. That wasn't meant to be humorous. The motivation behind it was genuine annoyance. The last straw seemed like more than just a minor irritation. Multiple accounts claim that Carson came to the conclusion that the show was merely recycling old content, with him rehashing the same impressions and gags from his earlier performances, with little to no variation. According to a long-term employee, Johnny was completely preoccupied with new content. He could spot when someone was restating themselves, and had an almost photographic memory for comedic bits. Because Rich made such frequent appearances, Johnny began to see recurring themes that casual viewers would overlook. This seeming lack of effort was intolerable to Carson. The Tonight Show's quality control was something he took great pride in, and he always expected guests, particularly repeat performers, to bring their A-game. In order to avoid an awkward confrontation, Carson told his booking staff to cease contacting Little. Every time Little's management tried to get in touch to propose an appearance, they were informed that the schedule was already filled or that the event was taking a new turn. The talent booker made the observation that the ban was more subtle than drastic. When it came to Johnny, he never once remarked, "I never want to see him again." Unlike with other artists. Summing it all up, he simply stated, I think we've seen enough of Rich for a while. And that while eventually turned into eternity. The tiny incident was noteworthy because it demonstrated Carson's intolerance for what he saw as a lack of creativity. Carson insisted on innovation and novelty from each artist who appeared on his show, in contrast to other presenters who may have stuck with tried-and-true favorites despite the recurrence. Observing Johnny, a former NBC executive noted that his priorities extended beyond ratings. Quality was important to him. It was nearly as inexcusable to him as poor behavior, if he believed someone was riding high on their previous achievements or not trying to develop new stuff. Years after his exile, Little found out for sure why he had been banished. After a former Tonight Show employee detailed Carson's grievances in follow-up interviews, Little regretted not having the chance to address Carson's issues head-on. "I could have created all new impressions if I'd known that was the issue," Little remarked in an interview in 2019. But in this line of work, the reasons behind door closures are hardly explained. They merely shut. Introducing Truman Capote. "I'm as tall as a shotgun and just as noisy. Are you open to inviting him over?" Number 6. Truman Capote, the disastrously disorganized showman. Talk show hosts in the 60s and 70s loved Truman Capote for his distinctive voice and biting humor. He was one of the most acclaimed American authors, known for Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood. However, Capote's public performances had started to suffer from his tragic spiral of alcohol and drug addiction by the time he made an appearance on The Tonight Show in 1975. What should have been a typical literary interview quickly devolved into one of the most uncomfortable episodes in the show's history. "You could tell something was wrong the moment he walked out," recalled a stage manager who was present that night. Truman was unsteady on his feet. His speech was slurred, and his eyes couldn't seem to focus. Johnny looked concerned before Capote had even reached the guest chair. Carson himself, no stranger to alcohol, had a strict professional policy about intoxication on his show. While he enjoyed drinking in his private life and sometimes referenced it in monologue jokes, he expected guests to be coherent and functional during their appearances. Johnny believed viewers invited him into their homes each night, and he took that responsibility seriously, explained a producer who worked on the show. He wouldn't embarrass his audience by showcasing someone who was clearly incapacitated. As the interview began, Capote's condition became painfully obvious. He struggled to complete sentences, occasionally lost his train of thought mid-word, and made several inappropriate comments about other celebrities that couldn't be aired on network television. Johnny tried every interviewing trick in his considerable arsenal, remembered a director who witnessed the disaster unfold. He asked short, simple questions. He tried to guide Truman toward topics he discussed in pre-in. He even attempted to turn it into a comedy bit at one point. Nothing worked. The breaking point came when Capote began telling a rambling story about a Hollywood party that veered into explicit territory, inappropriate for broadcast standards of the time. Carson quickly interrupted and threw to a commercial break earlier than scheduled. During the break, according to multiple witnesses, Carson confronted Capote directly about his condition. Johnny leaned in and said very quietly, "Truman, you're not well tonight. We're going to cut this short," recalled a stagehand who overheard the exchange. Capote tried to argue that he was fine, but his words were so slurred that they just proved Carson's point. When the show returned from commercial, Carson quickly wrapped up the interview and thanked Capote for appearing. The scheduled 10-minute segment had lasted barely 4 minutes, an almost unprecedented abbreviation in the show's history. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Carson personally instructed his booking team that Capote was never to be invited on The Tonight Show again, a ban that remained in effect for the remainder of his career. Johnny was furious, but not primarily at Truman, explained a producer who spoke with Carson after the show. He was angry at Capote's handlers for allowing him to appear in that condition, and at himself for not recognizing the problem before the cameras started rolling. The ban had significant consequences for Capote's later career. The Tonight Show was the essential promotional platform for authors with new work to discuss, and losing access to Carson's couch meant losing visibility with millions of potential readers. For a writer like Capote, who was already struggling with diminishing productivity, losing The Tonight Show was devastating, noted a literary agent familiar with Kapaw's career. His last major work, Music for Chameleons, received far less promotion than it would have with a Carson appearance, and sales reflected that. What made the Kapaw band particularly significant was how it revealed Carson's standards regarding substance abuse on his program. While he could forgive many transgressions, appearing obviously intoxicated on his show represented a form of disrespect that Carson found unacceptable both to himself and to his audience. Johnny wasn't judging Truman's personal demons, observed a friend of Carson's. He was protecting his show's integrity. There's a difference between having a few drinks before an appearance and being completely incoherent on national television. Kapaw's ban served as a warning to other celebrities who might consider using chemical courage before facing Carson's questions. The message was clear: show up impaired, and it would be your last appearance on television's most important stage. And we've got an A2-parter with probably one of the best shows on television. Hot show. And it's a show that, Seven Smothers Brothers, the political tension that led to exile. Tom and Dick Smothers were more than just comedians. They were cultural lightning rods whose CBS variety show had become famous and ultimately canceled for its outspoken opposition to the Vietnam War and pointed political satire. Their progressive politics and willingness to challenge authority had made them heroes to the counterculture and controversial figures to the establishment. Carson, who carefully guarded his own political views and preferred to keep The Tonight Show relatively neutral, had a complex relationship with the brothers. He respected their talent and had featured them on his program multiple times during the 1960s, but grew increasingly uncomfortable with their confrontational approach as political divisions in America deepened. Johnny walked a deliberate middle path politically, explained a writer who worked closely with Carson. He would joke about politicians from both parties in his monologue, but he never wanted The Tonight Show to become a platform for divisive political statements. The Smothers Brothers, by contrast, saw their comedy as explicitly political, a fundamental difference in philosophy. The breaking point came during a 1970 appearance that quickly veered from entertainment into political territory. According to those present, Tom Smothers began using his segment to deliver what amounted to an anti-war speech, rather than engaging in the light banter Carson had expected. Johnny's expression changed completely, recalled a camera operator who was working that night. His smile remained in place, but his eyes went cold. He hated being ambushed with agenda-driven content, especially when it departed from what had been discussed in pre-in. Carson, ever the professional, completed the segment without obvious tension. But according to staff members, he was furious backstage after the show concluded. "Too much trouble for what we get," Carson reportedly told his producer, using a phrase that would become his standard assessment of guests who brought unexpected complications to his carefully structured program. What followed wasn't an explicit permanent ban like some other celebrities received. Rather, the Smothers Brothers descended into what the team affectionately dubbed Carson Purgatory. They weren't officially barred, but offers to appear suddenly stopped coming their way. According to a booking coordinator who was involved with the event at the time, it was a form of soft blacklisting. Their names were never officially crossed out as possible guests, but every time they were, there was an excuse for why that week wasn't going to work. Their upper management finally understood and stopped calling after a while. Over the course of several years, the brothers were subject to a partial ban that reduced their once regular performances on The Tonight Show to infrequent, irregular appearances at most. In an interview from 2010, Tommy Smothers confessed, "These infrequent bookings came with strict preconditions about avoiding political material. We were effectively censored," he said it himself. "It would be fine if we made occasional appearances, but only if our comedy and music remained neutral. The invitations would dry up again the second we attempted to say something substantial." The Smothers Brothers incident was noteworthy because it demonstrated Carson's resolve to maintain The Tonight Show's entertainment content free of politically tinged content. But some hosts of the time, like Dick Cavett in particular, were all about the politics and scandal. Carson positioned his program as a way to get away from all of that stress on purpose. According to a former NBC executive, Johnny wasn't necessarily challenging the Smothers Brothers' opinions. Their attempt to politicize his entertainment platform was something he was strongly opposing. He thought his audience wanted to escape the drama of the day, not see it continued. Performers who believed their art was intrinsically linked to their politics occasionally clashed with Carson over this ideology. This conflict would follow him as the most influential host on television for the rest of his career. A television historian said that the Smothers Brothers affair exposed Johnny's main loyalty. His dedication lay in the entertainment industry, not in politics or social justice. Guests who couldn't distinguish between the two became less welcome on his couch as time went on. Some things are incredibly hot, as you will discover in the days, months, and years to come. Counting 8. The overly aggressive host, Morton Downey Jr. In contrast to Johnny Carson, Morton Downey Jr. embodied all that was wrong with him. Outspoken, hostile, purposefully contentious, and overtly political. In his late 80s syndicated talk show, Downey was known for yelling at guests, spitting smoke in their faces, and driving studio audiences nearly insane. In contrast to Carson, who encouraged polite discourse, Downey reveled in anarchy and confrontation. The stark contrast between the two men's television presenting styles became glaringly obvious during Downey's failed stint on The Tonight Show. A producer who was involved with the show at the time remembers that it was a complete disaster from the start. Class and restraint were embodied by Johnny. The new shock TV was starting to take shape, and Downey personified it. For Carson, he was more than simply an obnoxious nuisance. He was a danger to Carson's ideals about television. By 1988, Downey had reached the pinnacle of his fame and had been booked to appear on The Tonight Show. Some members of Carson's staff were opposed to the booking because they felt it gave Downey permission to air an unflattering style of broadcasting that did not belong on The Tonight Show. According to a talent coordinator who was engaged in the decision-making process, Johnny grudgingly agreed to the booking. He reasoned that, as the preeminent talk show presenter, he owed it to this emerging star to give him a shot at the big time. He would soon come to deeply regret that choice. The atmosphere was electric as soon as Downey stepped onto the stage. Downey broke convention by playing to the crowd, urging them to applaud, and strutting around the set as if it were his own show, instead of sitting in the guest chair as was required. According to a camera operator who was there, Johnny's face seemed really icy. The crew had perfected the art of reading his micro-expressions after years of working with him. An almost imperceptible spasm in his jaw and a subtle tightening around his eyes. Except for Downey, everyone else saw these warning signs. Downey tried to take charge of the interview as soon as it started by cutting Carson off mid-question, and instead speaking to the audience. Carson attempted to shift the conversation to Downey's history and where his combative style came from, but Downey retaliated by becoming more belligerent and hostile. According to a director who was present during the awkward session, Johnny used all of his interviewing tools. He made an effort at comedy, asked straightforward questions, and even subtly challenged Downey's method. The facade that Downey was adamant about upholding was impenetrable. When Downey started naming other talk show hosts and implying they didn't have the guts to tackle serious subjects head-on as he did, it became too much. Carson himself was clearly the object of the veiled critique. From the wings, a stagehand remembered seeing a shift in Johnny's eyes, but his smile remained constant. Carson retreated a little in his chair, a gesture that the crew knew as him removing himself from a guest he had determined was unworthy of his time. Carson thanked Downey with the same kind, aloof formality he used when thanking guests who had let him down, and the segment ended ahead of schedule. After the show ended, he reportedly became unusually forthright backstage, according to crew members. According to Carson's producer, he remarked, "And this isn't the big top." Although there was no official ban, Downey was never asked back to The Tonight Show during Carson's remaining years as host. His name was discreetly crossed off all lists of prospective future customers, according to people acquainted with the booking procedure. According to a former NBC executive, Johnny's loathing of him was just one factor. Carson saw Downey as emblematic of a trend in television that he thought was inherently harmful. A shift from dialogue to conflict, from wit to noise. The Downey scandal stood out because it brought attention to the generational change happening in television during Carson's last years on the air. The beginning of a more combative, aggressive style that would revolutionize the medium. According to a television reviewer who covered both men, Johnny was a gentleman host in a world that was getting progressively more ungentle. As Carson's methodical, deliberate approach started to crumble under the weight of something noisier and more contentious, Downey sounded the alarm.